Dr. Krishna, thank you so much for this excellent overview of the named topic. And our next speaker is yet another eminent historian, Dr. Robin Harris. Before coming to Croatia, he has spent many years as a political advisor of Margaret Thatcher. He was awarded a CBA for his political and public service in Britain. He was also awarded a High Croatian State decoration for his significant contribution to the development of cultural ties between the United Kingdom and Croatia. He has written books on Britain, France, and Croatia. His latest one, in fact, is on the history of Croatia. The only comprehensive history of the British Conservative Party is written by him. He wrote a biography of Margaret Thatcher. He wrote a book on Aloysius Stepinac too. His book on the history of Dubrovnik is an example of a meticulous historian's work and tremendous ability of comprehending it into an eminently readable text. Every one of his pieces are like that. Today, we will hear his presentation on partisan executions and terror in Dubrovnik. Dr. Harris, the floor is yours.
That was so generous. I don't think it was really about me, but anyway, some of it was true. Thank you very much, Arvoy. Well, let's have Dubrovnik on the screen. We all know what it looks like, but it looks better than me, so particularly this time in the morning. There we are. Dubrovnik is unique. Anyone who visits it feels that. Although designated according to geography as part of Dalmatia, Dubrovnik has little in common with the other Croatian cities on the Adriatic coast, except historic dependence on trade and the long-term cultural influence of Italy. Dubrovnik was an autonomous city-republic for centuries. The legacy, in many senses, remains. The old families have almost completely died out. Many traditions have not. Its politics have not been as polarized as elsewhere. It retained into modern times a reputation for continuity, culture, and Catholicism, all of which the Communist Party found deeply distasteful. Though in many ways different, as I've said, Dubrovnik also offers an important case study in the application of communism. A large amount of material has been researched and published, so we can study what the communists wanted and how they went about securing it. Dubrovnik was not annexed to Italy in April 1941. It was formerly part of the independent state of Croatia, the NDH. But it was occupied by the Italians. After the surrender of Italy in 1943, it was occupied by the Germans. They withdrew the following year as the war was being lost. The fate of the inhabitants in those years reflected that of others inside the independent state of Croatia. The Serbs and Jews were persecuted, most of the Jews, in fact, deported to Rab. There was a sense of surrounding and impending chaos, which eventually, in the autumn of 1944, engulfed the city itself. The partisans at that time established control of Dalmatia. As elsewhere, the process was carefully prepared. Local communists in May were, for example, instructed to provide material for what were called black books, so that offenders could, at the end of the war, be sought out by the army and punished. On the 13th of June, 1944, the Regional Intelligence Center of South Dalmatia sent to the Dubrovnik Area Committee of the Communist Party a list of what were described as suspect individuals, enemies of the people, and spies. The local party were to fill in the details about them, including their political views, so these could be inserted in the card index, that ubiquitous card index, kartoteca, that was being drawn up. Now here I'd like to make a point of general relevance. The impression that everything was planned, while correct, is only part of the truth. It doesn't allow for the fact that the execution of these plans depended in large part upon primitive people whom it was not easy to control. Against that, it is important also to remember that these people's hatred and crudity were useful, indeed indispensable, as part of the terror which the communists applied. Having Serbs from Herzegovina do the killing was thus obviously convenient. They needed no encouraging. But sometimes they went too far, too soon, and too obviously. And again we find instructions that liquidations were to be done secretly, conspirativno. So on the 18th of June 1944, the district committee of the Communist Party of Dubrovnik complained to the Dalmatian Regional Committee that soldiers in the Herzegovinian division were singing, "Every pit with a wide open gate is for every Croat." The partisans entered Dubrovnik unopposed on the 18th of October, but there had been fighting, killing, and disposal of bodies before that. The official party sources are only revealing of numbers despite themselves. So, for example, in April 1948, so some years later, when the authorities were making an effort to find out who had been sentenced, or indeed not sentenced, so as to ensure their property had been seized, the Dubrovnik area UDBA informed the Dalmatian UDBA that 108 enemies of the people had been shot between 1944 and the present, and gave their names. This cannot be a complete list, given how many unauthorized liquidations were effected in out-of-the-way locations. The day after entering Dubrovnik, the partisans killed a large group of young men at Orsula, at the eastern approach to the city, and such operations continued. During October, those arrested in Dubrovnik itself, in neighboring Konavle, at Ston, and at Janjina on the Pelješac Peninsula, were taken away to the island of Korčula. They were imprisoned, the majority of them, in the Hotel Praha in Korčula town, interrogated, and then liquidated, all 124 of them. Other sites of mass graves are at Dubrovnik's Boninovo Cemetery and at the old army graveyard on Montovjena. Let's have the Daksa. Evo smo. Those on the OSNA lists were rounded up, this is in Dubrovnik, and secured in different locations in the city. Hotels, villas, fortifications, private houses that had been taken over, before being concentrated in the old Carmen former courthouse prison. Initially, from the 19th to the 23rd of October, those held were able to communicate with and receive food from their families and sent out messages, some of which have survived. But at about 2 o'clock in the morning of 23rd, 24th of October, the prison doors opened, and the first group of 19 were taken out with their belongings, put into a lorry, taken to to Pile, that's the west gate of the city, then to Gruž. They got into a boat which took them 2 miles or so to the little offshore island of Daksa. Daksa had been the site of a Franciscan monastery, which was now ruined. The island was in those days deserted, except for a lighthouse keeper who was moved out for the occasion. Those who remained behind in the Carmen prison waited. The failure of the first group to reappear suggested their own fate. On the night of 24th, 25th October, at about 4 o'clock, the second group of 23 or possibly 26 people, the evidence is unclear, was also taken away. In fact, these numbers seem to be an underestimate, because on Daksa, 53 bodies have been exhumed, of which 35 have not as yet been identified, and 18 have been identified after forensic tests. Now, various accounts still circulate about the details of those killings, but of course no one can now be sure of the details. The physical remains show, however, that the victims were first stripped to their underwear, some still bound, and then all shot in the back of the head. Other sites in Daksa probably contain other remains. There was no trial. On Sunday 29th of October, however, a poster was put up which announced that 36 Dubrovčani had been sentenced to death by shooting because, as it said, after thorough investigation and on the testimony of witnesses, it was found that they had committed treason against the national liberation struggle of the peoples of Yugoslavia. A certain, shall we call it, irregularity in the proceedings, if anyone took the poster seriously, was apparent when the partisans were later seen with the watches and other valuables which they had stripped from those they'd killed. But who were the victims? Were they hardened Ustaša zealots and people with blood on their hands? Well, it's of course impossible to examine every biographical detail of each man executed, but the answer is very clearly no, they were not. They were people whom the communist authorities, as Juris said, thought stood in the way of completing the party's revolution. The most politically important victim was the former mayor, who was not an Ustaša but a Peasants' Party member. The most distinguished victim, as we've heard, was certainly the Jesuit priest Father Petar Perica, who composed two of the most loved and frequently sung Croatian hymns, one of which contains the famous line referring to the Virgin Mary as Queen of the Croats, Kraljica Hrvata. The professions of those singled out for liquidation show that they represented the intellectual and social elite that the communist revolutionaries in Yugoslavia regarded as incorrigible enemies of the people. So they included lawyers, businessmen, teachers, and journalists. There was a trade unionist. But the concentration on the clergy is most significant. 8 priests were killed on Daksa, 7 Catholic and 1 Orthodox. As far as is known, none of them had any military or political involvement. They were a problem because they were reckoned to be faithful priests. The story doesn't end on Daksa. The party's dealings with Dubrovnik continued. Dubrovnik was regarded, as I've said, with deep suspicion by the party. It was too bourgeois, too old-fashioned, too self-confident, and thus potentially disloyal. A barely literate letter dated 25th of October 1944 from Ante Jurjevic Baja, organizing secretary of the regional Oblast Committee of the Communist Party of Croatia for Dalmatia, is an important document. It refers en passant to the extrajudicial killings at that point underway. Baja admits that the killings on Daksa were without any court hearing and that the poster about the trial was just put up to satisfy people's curiosity. The partisans had, in fact, he says, killed about 60 enemies of the people, including 8 clergy. This Jurjevich Bayer, incidentally, after his time in Osna and Udba, was one of the most powerful figures in Dalmatia, a hero of the people, of course, but more importantly, the political boss of Split and controller of the shipyard. He died in 2001, an unrepentant communist, never charged with any crimes, despite those he here admits. But back to Bayer's other reflections, and I shall quote him. The people in this city are odd and to some extent incomprehensible, from the nobility, gospari, down to the common folk. They're full of their own peculiarity, which is very close to that of our enemies. And indeed, for those reasons, Dubrovnik has become, and will remain unless we purge it and commit our full attention to it, the center of spies, not only for Dubrovnik or the southern part of Dalmatia, but for a large part of Yugoslavia, especially Montenegro, Dalmatia, and Herzegovina. Moreover, he adds, they are great friends of the English. End of that particular quote from Bayer. In fact, the authorities in Belgrade thought that Osna was too lenient in Dubrovnik. In early December 1944, they complained, and I quote, "Our institutions are inactive in Dubrovnik. Ustaše, Chetniks, and Mačekovci, that's followers of Vlatko Maček, the Peasants' Party leader, do whatever they want. Increase your vigilance there." A characteristically paranoid Osna report of 17th of April 1944 states that dissatisfaction in the city was being organized by members of the Peasants' Party, the HSS, Yugo-nationalists, that's Serbs, Freemasons, Ustaše, priests, and members of the Allied mission in Dubrovnik, particularly British officers. Osna understood, however, that it was possible to practice selective terror and systematic liquidation without trampling openly upon local feeling. And this is shown by how the party had treated the celebration of the feast of Saint Blaise. That feast, celebrated on the 3rd of February, is kept, of course, throughout the Catholic Church. But in Croatia, it's recognized as the feast day of Dubrovnik's patron saint. Saint Blaise is to Dubrovnik what Saint Mark is to Venice. One might imagine that the partisans would be reluctant after they took power to permit those ancient practices. And some initially had doubts, but these were quickly overcome by their superiors. The reasoning provides an insight into the mix of brutality and subtlety with which religion and tradition were treated in Tito's Yugoslavia. When advice was sought whether the feast of Saint Blaise should go ahead, Nikola Sekulic Bunko, undoubtedly reflecting the shrewd judgment of Ivan Krajičić Stevo, head of the Croatian Osna, replied on the 20th of January 1945, and I quote Bunko, he said, "Allow the Dubrovčani to celebrate the feast of Saint Blaise as they have done hitherto. Avoid measures which distance us from the people. We shall hold to account anyone who, because of his behavior, weakens the people's sympathy for the people's liberation struggle." Well, paradoxically, it was a section of the clergy who opposed conducting the Saint Blaise celebration and procession with what the communist authorities pretended was normality. How much the subsequent accusations against them were well-founded, it's now impossible to tell. But pressure was clearly placed by some of the clergy upon the acting Bishop of Dubrovnik, Pavel Butorac, to refuse to accommodate the party's wishes, which involved the partisans participating in the procession. They wanted him to cancel the event, but this pressure the bishop resisted. In fact, the proceedings on the feast itself went off smoothly, despite some attempts at disruption. And allowing for the political slant, the report from Major Ljubo Krstulovic Šimić, deputy head of OSNA for the region of the 8th Corps of the National Liberation Army of Yugoslavia of 10th of February can be taken at face value, and I shall quote from this in extenso. At the time of the celebration of Saint Blaise, there were no shows, posters, declarations, recitations, etc., recalling the people's liberation struggle, nor any of the changes that the liberation had brought to Dubrovnik. Everything passed off as though nothing had happened. The Dubrovjani justify that, saying the celebration must be in the traditional spirit without a trace of the new. They insisted that on the special leaflet for the program, there should not be the star, the communist star, petokraka. The friars, the Franciscans and Dominicans, and the nuns sabotaged Saint Blaise. They tried to get the bishop to do so, but he would not, and he acted according to the traditional church custom. The report goes on. The celebration was organized by the institutions of our government, please note, of our government, and afterwards there erupted commentary from the reactionaries to the effect that the partisans had had to yield, but that it was just tactics. Others said that the partisans went to the celebration, but they didn't want to feed the hungry people, they just wanted to deceive them. They criticized the fact that our army, which wore the star, was part of the procession with the symbol of communism. Apart from that, the enemies of the people's liberation struggle used the celebration to distribute leaflets, and they did it 3 times. And he added, quote, "Nobody has yet spoken with the priests, although everyone maintains that all the hostility in Dubrovnik comes from them." Well, this last sentence of that OSNA report indicates what would happen once the Feast of Saint Blaise was out of the way. Among those arrested and sentenced to death for their participation in the movement to stop the Saint Blaise ceremonies going ahead, also for alleged communication with anti-communist fighters, Križari, but down there Škripari, was the Dominican friar Dominic Barač. A formidable intellectual, Barač was a target of party revenge. His book, The Social Philosophy of Bolshevism, was a critical dissection of communism from a Thomist perspective. That was not acceptable. Barač evidently possessed extraordinary courage and serenity. He encouraged the devotion of those incarcerated with him, first in Dubrovnik and then in Trogir, until he was led off to be shot. Another Dubrovnik priest there in Trogir, Father Ivo Bjelokosic, was first tortured, then sentenced to death, but unlike Barač's, his sentence was reduced to 20 years hard labor in Stara Gradiška. Leaving that prison as a mental and physical wreck in 1957, Bjelokosic returned, despite warnings, to his priestly vocation. He ended his days in 2001 as rector of Dubrovnik's Church of Saint Blaise, whose feast was no longer marked by troops wearing the 5-pointed star, which, along with socialist Yugoslavia, had now been consigned to Trotsky's famous dustbin of history. Thank you.